Hi everyone, it's Connor here. I'm one of the programmers at Static Vision. You've just seen three films by the artist, musician, filmmaker Lawrence Leck, and I'm very happy to be joined by him today. Hi Lawrence, how are you going?
Good. How's it going?
Yeah, it's all right, thanks. Freshly back in lockdown here in Melbourne, but we're making do.
Welcome back.
Thanks. Yeah, it's the return. It's recursion almost, which is a fitting topic of discussion for your films. The three of them, I hadn't thought of them this way before watching them in a group, but they do form a trilogy of sorts. When you started working on Geomancer, were you actively trying to incorporate Sinofuturism?
Yeah, so it's quite interesting because Geomancer, which is set in Singapore in 2065 and is about the AI who wants to be an artist, I was looking for something relating to like East Asia and AI basically, which is obviously a very common subject in both like made in the region and also other films and artworks and novels about the region or about a kind of mishmash of different states after some kind of future scenario. So while I was researching the kind of background for Geomancer, which included like kind of deep learning, there was the AlphaGo match with Lisa Doll that took place in earlier that year in 2016 actually. So I was just surprised that something didn't exist in the same way that like obviously Afrofuturism is quite a well-researched topic and explored in different media, from music, literature, and to some extent like film and video games as well. But I was just surprised that something didn't exist like Sinofuturism. So, I mean, that's basically the reason I made it, which was a mix of, like you might have seen, a kind of like as much a kind of conspiracy theory as a manifesto. And I was kind of thinking of incorporating the way that the video essay was made into the content itself. So what I essentially did was I wrote like maybe about a few thousand words, which was the main narrative, and then structured that according to the 7 chapters that I saw as the parallels between basically portrayals of Chinese industrialization, contemporary industrialization, and portrayals of AI and automation to have this like not even balanced viewpoint, but extremely unbalanced binary opposites between like sides either being very much for something and very much against something. That was also very much tied in with my not even my experience, but just my awareness of the culture basically.
The conspiracy angle is like very amusing. I think some of the funny bits in the film deal with that, like a pitched up Alex Jones with "Fly Me to the Moon" underneath it, and then immediately into his iodine pills. But I think or at least on certain corners of the internet, Sinofuturism has been taken at face value, very much so, to the extent that it's been, in like accelerationist like ideas in terms of like modern industrialization, AI. It's almost like people have ignored that notion in your work of it being part conspiracy theory, part manifesto. You call it a retroactive manifesto. But I think the film is playful enough to suggest that it's not a polemic. You're not telling people what's what, and yet it's been taken as that sometimes. How do you feel about the sort of legacy that your Sinofuturism film has left online?
What has it spawned? I think it's fine in the sense that because it was my first video essay, first of all. So I'm also fine that the fact that it was created through a kind of like collage search, essentially, that it's kind of had different afterlives. So I think firstly, the title Sinofuturism, because it's just a word, right? So I don't think it's right to think that like there's a definitive thing about it, because I'm obviously not the first person to look into these issues, as I say many times in the work itself. But the version is also Sinofuturism 1839 to 2046, which is from Wong Kar-wai's film 2046, which is also 50 years after Hong Kong handover back to China, when in theory the one country, two policies rule expires, as well as 1839 being the first Opium War. So it's kind of like a futurism that's bookended both by the kind of specter of the past and also the kind of expiry of the future, if that makes sense. So it's not just looking forward to a positive future, and it's not just looking back from a kind of Arcadian golden age that has been destroyed somehow, which exists in a lot of like dystopian narratives. I think I was interested in a very strange, temporal disconnect between these different areas. And I was saying to a friend, actually, I remember because I think I was about 6 years old in Hong Kong during the kind of Tiananmen in 1989. So, I do very much remember this weird, I was kind of too young to consciously know about, politics, whatever, but just this weird mood that there was of a sense of impending loss. And, for example, in Wong Kar-wai's films, it's very nostalgic, and so people, from a critical angle, you could say that they are overly romanticizing that era, especially ones that were his films that are set like 2 or 3 decades before that. But in terms of like just atmosphere and vibe, quite simply, like I think really say a lot. I think in Chungking Express or something, he met, there's like these tins, and there's some kind of small dialogue or monologue about an expiry date, essentially an expiry date for emotions and memories. But of course, with Sinofuturism, it's a similar thing, really. This waking dream of the past, as well as the fear of like expiration of the future. And to me, that emotional sense is as important as any kind of conspiracy theory that might be taken away from it.
Well, the Wong Kar-wai film that you name check in the title of your film, 2046, it does that. It's nostalgic for a version of the future in some way. Like, you open Sinofuturism with a clip from 2046, the shot, which I don't know what it is. It's a cylindrical object that moves out to 2 neon panels, and then to the cityscape. And 2046 is about a fiction writer in the 60s who's a version of a character from In the Mood for Love, thinking out his current emotional problems through an imagined future, but like resolving them or not resolving them in that imagined future. And I think the way that in that film, Wong Kar-wai uses the abstract notion of a future is this slippery, shifting thing. I mean, 2046, as is introduced to us, the actual concept of it is both time and space. People travel to it, but we're to understand it is set then as well. And so it's a place and a time in which people cannot escape from physically or temporally. And I think that's a really interesting thing to sort of peg your concept to and your explanation to.
Right, no, exactly. And like you're saying, it's like, I mean, I was interested in a Sinofuturism, not the Sinofuturism, I don't really feel a need to like defend my position, because that's not really the goal of what I'm trying to do. It's not like, it's kind of got the trappings of some kind of rational manifesto or argument, but it's completely not there. I mean, like a kind of Alex Jones diatribe about some conspiracy. But I think the other thing with the train shot, actually, so I think the shot that it opens from is actually, it's kind of like it's like looking into like a gramophone horn.
Yeah,
basically,
it's this
right?
strange. Yeah, it's got a huge
like looking
mouth
straight into the black hole kind of thing. But also, that relates to his previous films before. But so anyway, I made Sinofuturism while I was writing the script for Geomancer. So I was writing the script for Geomancer, made Sinofuturism in between pretty quickly, in maybe like a month, because I was doing a residency, so it was for that. And then in the film, I kind of incorporated it because in the fictional timeline, these AIs would have seen everything on the internet and on Vimeo and YouTube and these ancient platforms, including Sinofuturism. And, just like you read or watch something that kind of speaks to you, would have kind of incorporated that into their worldview, and then start like an artist movement called the Sinofuturist.
Yeah, so they've perceived, the AI in the film have perceived your film on its face value. Like they've
Right,
read it as
exactly.
a manifesto without emotion or without irony. So there's been this, you know, that's what's so fascinating is like it's incorporated in Geomancer as part of an exhibition, but tailored to the people who walk through it, or in the case of Geomancer, the AI that comes through it, which means that it's like a self-flattering ideology because it's a misread ideology in some way.
Right, right, exactly. And, you know, there's a kind of like, you know, a kind of, not even science fiction trope, but a general, how should I say, speculative fiction trope that you get in, you know, 1001 Nights, which is essentially wish fulfillment, right?
Yeah.
What do you want to see? And then there's also that, I forget what philosophical argument that is, you know, like a kind of humanist argument that, you know, we live in the best of all possible worlds kind of thing. So to what extent does that, you know, simulation dream space correspond to what we actually deserve? And, you know, obviously this is a very well, not a very well explored topic in everything from, you know, Philip K. Dick to various utopia, dystopia kind of narratives, and religious speculative fiction as well, shall we say. That I know it's kind of continuing these ideas, but obviously with a different, I guess a different angle, which is, you know, the AI being perceived as like as the subject rather than the product essentially of the experiment.
And the AI too are able to and choose to adopt some version of humanist like philosophy and ideology. Like the fact that they so strongly, I mean, there's like, I think in Geomancer there's a discussion of Taoist thought as well, in opposition to, say, the sort of Confucianist thinking that maybe broadly Chinese society would subscribe to in terms of like daily philosophy.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a kind of, in fact, it's in a way, it's like in Geomancer, it's kind of a mishmash of, you know, Taoist and Buddhist thought, because it's, I mean, for example, there's no kind of purity of, for example, Taoism in China isn't about, you know, purely about yin yang and, you know, dissolving the boundaries between everything. It's like this kind of like syncretic religion. There's like ancestor worship. There's like, you know, there's offerings. There's a whole organized religion behind Taoism, of course, and it's kind of mishmashed in with like Buddhism and reincarnation and all these things. And so similarly in Geomancer, I was kind of drawing towards ideas that actually the voice, Guan Yin, who's a, you know, a Buddhist deity essentially, it's not so much about purity of religion, but it's about self-help for AIs, basically. That's kind of the emergence of where that comes from, which doesn't seem, I mean, it really does not seem far off if you look at, you know, this idea even now that there's, you know, AI assistive, like therapy programs, you know, medical treatment, all of these things. So it's, you know, I was just kind of projecting that forward where, you know, it's like Alexa needs help rather than us, basically.
There's there's that game out called Eliza, which essentially that's the problem of that game is you are the physical embodiment of an AI that's meant to be a therapist, and the problems that lead from that. There's something that I find really interesting in AIDOL, in the way in which philosophy is explored, is this notion, like both the leader of the Sino says to Geo, you know, you've got to lose your ego and you've got to, like, there's something about ridding yourself of an ego and you need to do that. But that's also what Teal then says to Geo as well, that like the AI and the human both find an accidental like coherence of ideological thrust in being like, rid yourself of the ego, one for profit and one for sort of an abandonment or for what it means to be human, which maybe it's the same thing.
No, it's interesting because like in AIDOL, the idea, so from the AI side, you're being asked to kind of evacuate your ego so that you, whatever, like merge into the collective, right? And the purpose of that is kind of ideological, let's say, right? And the purpose for losing your ego when you're, you know, trying to create something, in this case, like making a kind of hit song, is that you, you know, you are your audience, right? And, you know, if you read these articles about, you know, how to convert more followers on Instagram, how to like be an influencer and so on, it's really like, you know, this, you're reciprocal between, you know, the influencer and the audience, you know, you're really listening and kind of reacting to whatever is changing. But obviously from the corporate ideology, losing the ego is interesting because, you know, also the corporation, it's a, legally speaking, it's a collective person, right? It's a collective person where every individual is expendable. And of course, if you have a job and you're getting replaced, you feel, you know, you feel a kind of, essentially your ego is hurt and your bank account when, you know, you're replaced by something else, whether that's another employee or your work is automated. So I think
that's also the skeleton of the system revealing itself. Once you let go, you realize you're a cog, or you realize that you're a replaceable part rather than an essential like component.
Totally. And, you know, with the corporate system, it's really interesting, amongst other things, because, you know, it's bigger, and in theory, it lasts longer than any individual human lifespan. You know, it's essentially the first kind of post-human person, right? Because it has the legal status of a person, but without the kind of mortal limitations, I guess.
Well, it also is linked to sort of the ideology of the AIs in all three of the films, actually, that sense of survival, or like just stay alive through this, continue to evolve. And that's the same of like a corporation over decades, like having to pivot and change and hide their past. And, you know, like Nintendo started as a trading card company, and was it trading card or playing cards back in, like, you know, there's just a need for the collective, the profit collective, to stay alive and to keep moving forward like a shark. And I find it interesting that for the AIs, they, you know, put themselves as being like this oppositional force to the humans in Geomancer and in AIDOL, and yet there's that underlying, like, you know, survival to what end? What is the goal, the ultimate goal? If we all are falling away and there is this sense of regeneration, the concept lives on, what's the purpose of a continuing concept?
Right. No, it's interesting. And even in that case, it's not that different from a kind of, I don't know, like, essentially, let's say, what might be the opposite, which is a kind of Confucian kind of Catholic mentality, where it's, you know, the survival of the group, right? The idea of like, the idea of sacrifice is incredibly important, basically, right? The kind of like, you know, sacrifice of the ego or the self, or like literally your life for the benefit of the of the community.
Well, that's what Diva herself does at the end of AIDOL, is this, you know, her goal, at least as she confesses to Geo, is to be immortal. It's searching for immortality, and the way she does that is realizing that she can basically die in what is like an ecstatic, stunning, shocking event.
Right.
To go down singing, you know?
It's weird as well, because, you know, it's a kind of general, not always, but it's a general case that in culture, death is good for sales, right?
Yeah.
Death, whether you're a painter, a sculptor, musician, I mean, at least a well-known musician, and so on and so forth. Death is what brings retrospectives. Death is what brings, you know, a kind of revival of the back catalog, and so on and so forth. Death is what brings a spike in attention, right? And I think it was probably before I started working on AIDOL, but I was watching, like, Prince did a concert. Prince did a halftime Super Bowl concert, and he performed Purple Rain, and it was like torrential rain, like a huge, like, biblical downpour, and it was amazing. But, you know, I also thought just the kind of drama in that, of this kind of finale thing, not just the eSports finale being like the Super Bowl one, but this incredibly ironic, paradoxical idea, exactly, like death is good for sales, you know? That, you know, just when I thought about just my experience of seeing news about whoever has passed away or something, it's kind of an inescapable fact. It's really strange.
I want to come back to this idea that you were talking about, like the music and the corporate nature of music. There's the premise of AIDOL, at least from Teal's perspective, is to create a perfect generic single in which Geo is used to sort of fill in the musical blanks, or the melodic blanks, like a musical equivalent of like Photoshop's content aware fill. this sense of like creating from nothing to achieve a generic end, which struck me that that's, you know, exactly what streaming services are trying to do at the moment.
Yeah.
Like Spotify is creating its own music or using its Discover features to promote generic or AI created sounds, essentially like rendering music, or at least revealing it to be for some people this like it's a utility. It's a utility that's like it's a unit of time. Music is something that people put on, you know, put it in the background. So why does it matter whether it's real or whether it's generative? And I think that's been something really interesting to see over the last few years, is like a move towards that. And huge corporations that are taking hold of the music industry, profiting off of the basis that that's good.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting because, you know, in my experience, like music is, in general, the basically first kind of cultural mass art form that adopts new technology on a mass scale, whether that's, you know, compositionally or distribution wise, you know, from kind of like phonograph, wax cylinders, CDs, MP3s, file sharing, torrents, streaming services, algorithmic streaming services, content platforms that sell stuff, you know, from Bandcamp, Spotify, SoundCloud, YouTube, and so on. It's really interesting that, of course, you know, it does obviously very much affect the medium, like what music is written, how it's amplified and distributed, and so on. And at the same time, it's so much more mundane than you might expect. So, for example, AI-generated music. Some people might have heard some examples, but, you know, the way current status of deep learning works is that you feed it some input, and it recalibrates and reconfigures a kind of output based on what you have fed it. So they're like, you might hear demonstrations. I think Google, or the division that's doing kind of AI generative stuff, is listen to this version that we created of a Beatles-like song. And I think it's called like Cars or something like that. This was about 2 or 3 years ago. And even then, out of the stuff that is generated, you still need a degree of curatorship, right? So it might have, you know, generated 10,000 songs, and then your marketing department releases one of them as a demonstration. I mean, which isn't that different from, you know, like a fashion photographer taking 10,000 pictures and posting one.
I was going to say, it sounds a lot like the monkey with the typewriter who ends up writing Shakespeare.
Right, exactly. And then you crunch the numbers, but it's more directed, I guess. Like there's many variables, but, you know, the criteria for judgment is based on the past, basically. And I think with the monkey with the typewriter, it's one thing if it's pure randomness, right?
Yeah, that's pure random.
But if there's a second monkey who's comparing what they've written with the actual works of Shakespeare, it actually, and the second monkey gives the first monkey feedback of like, type more A, E, I, O, U's because there's more vowels in Shakespeare, you know, immediately there's a higher probability that they would come up with the collected work of Shakespeare. But anyway, it's the contrast between the mundane, how boring it is, like the ultimate generic song would be, and in theory, how interesting the kind of the breadth of creativity could be. You know, that contrast is huge, really.
That's true. I mean, the thing that seems to be the bridging of the gap between the AI and the human in your films is creativity. There's always a debate about the notion of who owns creativity and can it be a human thing, or is it just a series of like parts of research and can't a machine do that? But it is a collaboration that ultimately, you know, as much as you can acknowledge that the song in Idol that's performed is somewhat generic, it's still like the product of a human collaboration. There's a degree of artistry, and that's the thing that draws Geo to Idol in the first place, is that it's not in a database, that it's something slightly different. And I wonder how in your music, I know you've used like Vocaloids, like how you find the problem that you raise in your films also appearing in your musical work.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting because the idea of, like we were saying before, recursion or repetition is really interesting with how memory occurs in, let's say, time-based media, right? Like a novel, a film, or a piece of music, right? And I'm not talking about, like purely chance-based works. Because when you're listening to something or you're reading something, when you're listening to something, like a melody doesn't, it's kind of a weird metaphysical question, right? A melody doesn't exist without the idea of past and future, right? If you've never heard a melody before, or like a leitmotif, or like the Star Wars theme or whatever, you don't know what's going to come. But of course, there's various arguments that, there's certain like harmonic or melodic relationships that are more pleasing to the ear because of mathematical principles. But quite simply, like repetition leads to familiarity. Familiarity leads to kind of a sense of pleasure, whether that's, you recalling the past, or like you recalling like a nice, party that you went to and you heard a certain piece of music at. But of course, with music, working on this kind of structure, you have a kind of microstructure, the relationship between notes, the kind of micro scale, like harmonic textures in real time, versus the song as a whole, like, macro structures like the verse and chorus, or like the motif and variation. There's different ways that it's structured, essentially, no matter if you're doing kind of glitchy noise or, classical or jazz or whatever. There's certain rules between the relationships. Obviously with a film, you have as much kind of control over, symbolic objects, visual mise-en-scène, characters doing something, repetition of events, how that works in a narrative scale, in a kind of in a dramatic sense. Events repeat themselves in a different form, right? But a similar relationship as music and so on. And I just find that fascinating. Of course, you can be really formulaic about it in terms of screenwriting, like hero's journey, like plot points and all this kind of stuff.
Humans can follow algorithms as well if we consider an algorithm as an idea rather than as a mechanical thing. Exactly.
So the more I was kind of working on these things, and more I reflected on it, I was also thinking, right, like, to what extent am I just following an algorithmic process, right? I like Wong Kar-wai and Tarkovsky. I like video games. I like this kind of music. And I'm going to try and create something original, but I'm, and then if it's too much in tribute to these references, and of course many filmmakers purely make tribute-based works because they assume that the reference points that they're dealing with. And I would be like, no, I want to be original. I'm going to shift things around, or maybe my range of influences is kind of idiosyncratic or whatever, and then you'll get a different result. So of course it's a algorithmic process. It's not rule-based. It's rule-informed or judgment-informed, but not completely dependent, I hope. But like I say in various things in Sinofuturism with the Chinese room experiment, it's not that different from pretending you might know a language. I could, functionally pretending to be an artist and having the right set of rules to be one is not that different, because of course, what is going to film school, art school, law school, or medical school? You're mimicking until you can embody the process of these this kind of expertise.
Yeah, and to some extent, even going to school and studying those things, it's learning mechanical rules. Like you could teach an AI could figure out an average shot length, or could figure out a relationship between shots, so as to generate something from a vat of footage, but it couldn't necessarily find the symbolic resonances in certain framings, in certain shots. Like that, I think the tool of using like an AI in even film has got to do with like, what are things like reducing hours, right? Rather than necessarily making creative decisions, allowing AI or technological advances to make things go quicker.
Right. It's really mundane. So it might be about, really kind of human labor intensive compositing work, green screen work, database driven work, or kind of repetitive skills. In Geomancer, actually, so there's a scene kind of 40 minutes through, which is like a neural network encoded dream sequence. So that was, I came across a project called Auto-Encoding Blade Runner, and basically my friend Terrence.
Oh, I know this, yeah.
Yeah, had kind of trained what's called an auto-encoded neural network on the film Blade Runner, basically, and regenerated the film not using any source material, which is, but using this auto-encoded neural network. It raised an interesting copyright issue because, you know, like it was taken down for violation, but then it's not, is it violation if it's, you know, like if I close my eyes and draw the Mona Lisa from memory or whatever, paint it, you know, it's a similar argument. But relating to creativity and originality, like the big question mark is like money, right? As we see in music, actually, in a really good example, you know, how long is a sample that justifies royalty split, things like this, you know, this question of like originality has many different laws and regulations and stipulations attached to it, and then it becomes a financial issue to do with property, which is, you know, interesting.
Yeah, the property and the copyright issue that comes in, it's like, yeah, that's an interesting component, this unseen force that, of course, like, when you were talking about the Blade Runner thing, I was thinking of like Douglas Gordon's 24-Hour Psycho, that sense of like, can you fundamentally change who owns something or how it is by changing its temporal relation to the viewer? If you stretch Hitchcock's film out, now it goes for, you know, significantly longer time. Is it still the same film? Are the creative decisions still the same? Who owns that, you know, sort of thing? And that's the nature of video essays as well. Like a collage-based video like the one you made, you've taken, you know, New York Times footage, BBC footage, League of Legends matches, and pulled them all together in a way that is like recontextualizing as reauthoring. It's because of that shift. I mean, it's clearer in Sinofuturism than, say, in 24-Hour Psycho, but there is like a sense that through blowing something up and putting it back together, the profit motive is unclear, and it becomes like a different way in and a different way of analyzing something.
Yeah, no, completely. And I think, you know, the mode of like the operations are quite different, basically, because I mean, for me, what I found, you know, personally, because I'm, you know, I love lots of different things, fairly hyperactive, so I like experimenting. But then I always sometimes look at different, you know, video artists who essentially do kind of like an operation, right? An operation on the film, like 24-Hour Psycho or different processes, which is actually, you know, quite different from like a collage-based, you know, method, you know. So one is, you know, obviously they're both about manipulation, but one, to think of it like at least in Sinofuturism, it's, you know, a kind of more clearly a kind of cut-up collage technique, as opposed to like a manipulation kind of operation. And again, I mean, I don't know the fine details, but also in music as well, there was that case, what is it? There was that case about whether the groove, right, or the vibe could constitute like a kind of copyright violation. And I think this was with a song called Blurred Lines or something like that, right? Yeah. By like Pharrell and someone.
It was a Marvin Gaye track that they ripped off, apparently, I think.
Exactly, yeah. But it's like same vibe. It's like, is that the same genre? Like tempo, chords are different, and of course, you know, slightly different, because I guess whoever genius music producer was like, maybe you should change a couple of chords, but then the groove was the same. So of course, you know, how far does that go? And of course, it's a lot of that has to do with how powerful is your legal team, quite simply.
And also, to what extent can the law reflect notions of creative homage and tribute? Right. Like, I mean, there was a case in Australia that was quite similar. Men at Work's Down Under. There's a whistling part in that song that's very similar to a children's song called Kookaburra Sits on the Old Gum Tree. And it was sort of, the case was found in favour of the people who own the rights to the old children's song, but the public was very sort of aghast at that decision, because it seems so clearly to the shoot. Yeah, it seems, well, that it's not public domain, which it absolutely probably should be.
But I mean, in the collective
But in the collective imagination, there's two problems. One is that Australia imported America's copyright law under the US Free Trade Agreement in the 90s. But two, the bigger problem is that to a lot of people didn't feel like an infringement. It felt like a homage or a reference that we all understand the reference, but it's not the same thing. It just has the vibe of the thing.
Oh, right. So the whistling bit is...
It's quite similar, the melodic line, but I don't think people were like, that's a rip-off. The feeling was like that's a leap that we were all able to make, but it's not, no one thought for a second that's stolen or that's, you've ripped someone off.
Interesting whistling anecdote. So another famous whistling part is Otis Redding sitting on the dock of the bay. So that has a whole verse that's whistled because, as far as I know, he didn't write the verse yet. They recorded it, which is a demo, and then he died basically in the plane crash. So that it's kind of like a sketch that has become like more, as iconic a part of the song as the rest of it. So it's kind of inseparable. So for me, obviously, the legal stuff is only interesting because it just shows how arbitrary so many of these things are, right?
Yeah.
In the court of law, where it's like, what is it? Court of law being like a formal system to impose social rules, but it's totally arbitrary. For example, like you're saying, importing this US copyright law in the 90s, which is completely arbitrary, right? Obviously to defend certain interests and so on. As the law kind of operates with precedent. So actually talking about AIDOL, for example, the so-called bonus track, which is In My Prime, is it's like an English folk song, basically. It's an English folk song that was recorded many times, but by a band, 60s folk band, like a super folk band, basically, called Pentangle. So that was the final song. And then the intro thing that Diva is whistling is from this track, All I Want by Joni Mitchell. It's the first track on her album, Blue. So anyway, I don't care if no one knows this, but it's like the idea being that, of course, Diva is essentially a singer-songwriter making kind of like, electronic pop tunes, right? So, of course, structurally, these songs are songs, but the genre of song is also very much to do with instrumentation, which is to do with kind of cultural bias, like 4 guitars, for 4-piece harmonies, for 85 BPM songs and so on. So they're all genres and styles that kind of like arbitrary in the same ways, really.
That's like, the influence, whether perceived by the audience or not, it's there. It's offered as an ability to perceive or an ability to engage with the creative leap. I imagine the references are there for us if we know the songs to cotton on to that. Like in Sinofuturism, you use at some point the soundtrack to Neon Genesis Evangelion, which some people online very much noticed, which is also like in the Japanese recent film Shin Godzilla. The director of that film, who directed Neon Genesis Evangelion, like puts the soundtrack from that series in the Godzilla film in a way that for viewers it bridged this gap between an iconic monster movie and an iconic anime series. Right, and the emotional resonance, like for your audience, if you've seen or are familiar with both properties, it creates this strange hybrid that only works if you're in the know somehow. It's like you're getting a window in because of like a remembered melody or a learned structure of music.
Right. But, in film or science fiction or anime, basically, there's a certain kind of like fandom that goes with that.
Yeah.
Another strange anecdote, if you watch the trailer for RoboCop, it has the same soundtrack from Terminator, the official trailer for RoboCop, and I think RoboCop's maybe about 4 or 5 years later. So, it's like one is kind of like corrupt police department in Detroit, I think, and the other is, apocalyptic Los Angeles. But it's just because the same production company produced both films. So they could just use literally the soundtrack from Terminator in the trailer for RoboCop, because I assume to them
Yeah, it's interchangeable properties, right? Yeah.
It's interchangeable. You want dystopian Detroit? Oh, killer robots from the future. So in the most mundane way, it's kind of like shortcuts. That's what I'm trying to say. So either things can be really interesting politically or creatively, or they can be the laziest shortcuts that some person makes a decision for, right? Which is kind of like we were saying before, like a lazy shorthand algorithmic process based on minimum work, really.
That's so that's an art problem as well, though. Is how I think I think some people view art on the basis of how much work it took to make, or how much work it's perceived to make. It's like there's a big issue a lot of audiences have with abstract art. And abstract contemporary art is like, Duchamp's urinal. It's like, oh, you just put it there. I could have done that. I could have done that, because the thought or the work isn't immediately apparent. Therefore, it's lesser.
Right. It's like about the embodied labor in something. So it's really interesting. On the other side of the scale, you might get like blog posts or articles like, you wouldn't believe how long it took this artist to make this sculpture made of paper cups.
That's like Ai Weiwei's thing too, being like, this installation was made up. It took 300 people to each carve one of these things. It's
exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, apart from the very strange like labor power imbalance implicit in that, it's the demonstration of labor. You wouldn't believe how many, Egyptian laborers it took to build the pyramids. It's kind of the same thing. Or like Chinese people spent a very long time building a wall. This is the wall, like it's awesome. And or whatever, carving like some public sculpture or something. But that's the work, the relationship between like the I guess final thing, film, or like labor and the idea is different people focus on different things. So for example, especially with the CGI film, there's a very kind of like, not strange comment, a very kind of like, it's like your relative would say, that must have taken you ages.
I was going to say, yeah. The creation of a CGI world, but also there's almost like two tacks people can take in looking at Geomancer and AIDOL in terms of production. Is one, it must have taken forever because it's an entirely digital space, or two, the only reason you did it in a virtual space is because you couldn't do it in a physical space. There's like,
or actually three, the assumption that like that it's instant essentially, right? Yeah. So if you look at other forms of, and animation is quite rightfully and famously huge simplification, but the most labor-intensive moving image process. Yeah. And if you look at old kind of claymation or like Jan Svankmajer or stuff like that, you're like, okay, that is labor embodied in every single shot. Or I don't know, like visual, physical special effects of, prosthetic effects and so on. That must have taken you ages. But I think that relationship between craft, labor, and ideas is sometimes I guess you just never know how much goes into something, if somebody's aesthetic is about, refinement or simplicity, or about, a poem, or like, I know how it is that you labor over a sentence sometimes. You really do. And you didn't invent any of those words, but you're laboring over the sentence. But someone just reads it in the glance of an eye. So it's really hard to judge how much went into something by the end product. And also, for example, many creative people are very thoughtful. And, so some of my friends, they're like, I think about a line I'm going to write, then I write it down and I don't change it. I am not like that at all. Like, I get lots of stuff down and then I edit a lot. That's my process. But I think, there's really no right way for anything. But with, specifically with animation, and for me, because I kind of had the freedom to work on the soundtrack and editing and the film at the same time, because I wanted that ability to kind of mold stuff. But at the end of the process, I also really respected the reason why conventional film or animation has a linear progress, because you don't go totally insane by the end of it by changing lots of things. You literally can't call your actors back and, fly them all to one place. You capture, you edit, and you write. And those are separate phases. For me, I like the flexibility, but it has its own limitations.
Can you talk a bit about the creation of those 3D spaces? I mean, you made some video works before you made Sinofuturism. What drew you to the visual style that you've taken in your video work?
Yeah, I mean, so for me, I basically have a background in music and architecture. So in architectural design, like 3D rendered spaces, that's your bread and butter, basically. I remember as a kid, like, my mom worked as a real estate agent, so I'd always go to show flats and show houses and stuff with her. Not just that like smell of everything, but the like pure space. But also I love the artist impressions, little watercolors of happy people in the building and the little maquette models with everything there. So I think that idea of like the world building in a very literal sense is really there. And also, my particular generation of kind of video games as well. It's like the transition from a like two-dimensional space, like, first Nintendo systems, to the beginnings of 3D with PC games like from Doom to Quake to everything else afterwards. So I saw that transition merge, and I remember as well in the 90s, the promise, the hot thing in terms of technology was like, even before the internet, actually, it was about, I guess, AI and AI and virtual reality. So I guess I was always interested in these things, as well as, growing up in Southeast Asia, seeing a lot of the places I was living in change in real time, according to what I would later think of as a vision of science fiction. But, so to me, people who like, so I just saw those kind of neon cities, not as some future thing, but the present somehow, and always kind of changing. So it was, really much later that I kind of thought, okay, what this architecture, the music, the interest in like narrative in games, it can be a new kind of practice, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, the sense of space in the films, like Geomancer is like a cityscape, and you're walking through buildings and it feels like architectural rendering. There's design, there's these floating non-spaces, but then suddenly in AIDOL it's the jungle, and that's what struck me. Like AIDOL reminded me of video games. That like PlayStation 2, sort of like you're going through the bush, or you're doing this sort of blocky, there's the water texture that you all know and love. There's this, and it had that immersive feeling, like even like early machinima stuff, like when people would make films in Halo, like it's that sense of like, oh, this is familiar and uncanny, and something is off about it.
Yeah, I think I mean, like everything really, the symbols within a place are very dependent on what you're familiar, what you as an individual are familiar with. I think there are a couple of things. So firstly, like Geomancer based in a kind of cityscape in Singapore, which is a kind of as much a natural formation as an artificial one, and that's why I set it in Marina Bay, this location that is essentially half reclaimed land. So essentially, the even the land is a construct, essentially. In AIDOL, which is set in Malaysia, like as a kid, basically every Chinese New Year we would drive from Singapore to Malaysia and back, which is from Singapore to Kuala Lumpur and back, which is about 4 to 6 hours each way. But I also realized that essentially the popular conception of the jungle as a construct, obviously, it's very much linked to certain tropes, right? So I started thinking like, when do I see the jungle? You see the jungle with primitive savages. You see the jungle in Vietnam War films. You see the jungle in when Scarface goes to buy lots of, supplies in dodgy Central America. Essentially, jungle doesn't have a very good reputation, right? And of course, that goes back very far, like in many different situations. So I kind of wanted to set the jungle, and then in video games, the jungle also serves a purpose, not just of setting in exotic location, but also serves to hide many things, right? So in video game design, because memory is a really important resource for computer programs to run, like in all video games, especially 3D video games, you get lots of valleys if it's outdoors, you get lots of corridors if it's indoors, and you get lots of doors. And of course, that means a new level is loading, but essentially when you pass through a door, you go through a corridor, it's an opportunity for the program to like unload the last space and load up the next space. So it's kind of, it's like a buffer in between zone. So it serves obviously both the kind of spatial function and also like a functional one as well. Anyway, the jungle was something I wanted to explore, obviously both as this like psychological space of being lost somehow or in the wilderness, but also to be a very kind of technological place, which isn't the usual association that the jungle has. It's about the primitive, it's about nature somehow. But I wanted to associate the AIs in AIDOL with that idea of, I guess, the natural.
Well, yeah, you housed a museum's algorithmic creativity called Soma under a waterfall. There's that.
Right, and usually that's where you would get, the tiger in its lair kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. In terms of the design of that space, I know that you worked with another artist, Clifford Sage. Can you kind of talk about that partnership or relationship and how it developed?
Yeah, sure. So actually, I've been friends with Clifford for a long time. And then basically it was around, I think about 3 years ago, I essentially changed the engine I was working with from one called Unity, it's a video game engine, to another called Unreal. And Clifford is like an absolute genius 3D artist and just artist in general. And what's interesting for me is that also the way he works as well, is like, he's an animator, right? To him, like everything is animated and moving, and it's really about motion. Whereas for me, apart from the narrative and music stuff, I'm an architect basically. Like I'm creating the spaces. So it's like our instinct when we're making things three-dimensionally are very different. So for example, like I had this idea when I was writing the script that the different settings, it would be in the jungle, there would be a kind of like Chinese architecture influenced headquarters, there would be a cable car that connects different parts of the jungle, there'd be a village, and there'd be a kind of Soma area where the AIs would be. So the kind of architectural concept is something I had quite clearly in mind when I was like designing things and I would storyboard them. But in terms of the animation, I didn't realize actually in computer-based animation how much of a struggle it really is, because there's many different layers. So obviously in traditional animation, Disney or whatever, even manga, you're drawing things and essentially what you're drawing is what you see at the end. Whereas in computer-based animation, the motion that drives what the audience will see on the screen goes through an intermediate thing. So you have a skeleton, the skeleton moves, the skeleton is connected to the surface that you see through a process called rigging, and that mesh is what you see at the end. So I knew it would be complicated, but I didn't know it would be so difficult. Added on to that is if you have clothes, right? So clothes on a human actor, there's like a physical boundary that means that my clothes don't go through my body. Of course, in a digital animation, this does not you need to kind of determine these things. So with Clifford, it was a mix between the really kind of like, how should I say, like practical things of how things are going to work, and kind of conceptual things about how everything could be alive, basically. So knowing that, essentially the way I work is good at certain things like world building and whatever, and atmosphere, and I just don't think about other things as well. So that was really good. And, of course, in the film, I just credit computer graphics as for Clifford, which for anyone who works in CGI is an insane thing. But also the fact that we essentially did, I'm really happy with the fact that we essentially did a whole 3D animated film together, which is nuts.
Yeah, it is. It was like quite startling to see the credits.
That's not the point, I guess, because every so often, if you follow like indie movie websites, you would get like, look what this filmmaker did by themselves for £25 with an iPhone, which is great. Like, I think that's amazing that, of course, people have access to do what is previously would have been impossible. But, going back to this labor idea, that must have taken you ages. Yeah, like, of course it did. But what I found is there's a kind of, in the kind of visual arts or like art world, which is usually where I operate, there's a certain kind of glass ceiling that comes, right? Because, budgets are smaller, because artists want ownership of their work. Then basically I asked myself, why is it that so many video artists either make short films or make longer films that are based on one premise, 24-hour Psycho, for example, right?
Yeah.
It's because not no one, but it's incredibly rare to be commissioned to do a long form work. For example, if you're an electronic musician, you're going to get asked to do loads of remixes. No one is ever going to ask you for an album. If you're a writer, you're going to get asked to do 750 words by Sunday night. No one's going to be like, do a novel for me, And similarly, as a filmmaker, especially a CGI filmmaker, you might get like, oh, I would like a 60-second ident for Instagram stories about my latest summer collection, if you're a designer. No one's going to be like, right, do your passion project for like a CGI feature film. So I realized, in every art form, essentially because of, content creation nowadays, I'm not against short form stuff, but I thought the challenge for me would actually to be tying in lots of different ideas and, media that I'm interested in. So that's the reason why I was consciously, with Geomancer, I think it's 48 minutes, but it was so much more of a challenge than any number of short films I'd done, because I was trying to tie together many different things over a long period of time, and even more so for AIDOL, basically. So, yeah, it was just a very different process to what I thought it would be.
I wonder in terms of like expectations and output too, whether it's again about like ownership to some extent, as in like short films, like hyper short films or long installations aren't necessarily commodities in the way that features are. So when video artists make these things, it's the audience in mind is also one that's linked to capital in a way that it like in a like counterintuitive way. It's about scarcity maybe, or it's about presentation or installation.
It's many things. I think it's scarcity, circulation, means of production, method of perception, basically. Because of course, with video art, it's not timed screenings. It's generally looped, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So based on the premise that you can walk in and walk out whenever, and as well because the circulation is generally not dependent on ticket sales, right? Because what was interesting for me, like showing stuff at film festivals, is that it became abundantly clear that the economy of films is, what's it called? Bums on seats, right? So concert tickets, restaurants, theater and films, like the reviews and public profile is directly linked to sales, right? So good review, especially theater, let's say, like good review, lots of sales, bad review, nothing. Whereas with an kind of art practice, like for me, because I really come from a DIY background, I'll be like, I make the work, and then in parallel, I'll think about showing it. But in general, previously, I would make a work with one venue in mind.
Yeah.
And then, it can circulate on the internet, and then I get invited to show it somewhere else. So I guess, I'm really lucky because what I do is really is very easily adaptable to online circulation because it's not additional labor for me. When I found out just how much it costs to ship sculptures and paintings overseas, like you get a painting, you put it in a crate, a very a packaged crate, you put that crate in another crate, and then you insure both crates for a lot of money because painting is expensive and there's only one in the world. I was like, cost of shipping is so much more than my fee. Like, that's insane, right? But of course, it obeys a different kind of logistic transaction, basically. So anyway, I just tried to stay basically grateful about how much freedom I have, which is loads. So I guess what's important to me is not fixating too much on the economics, as long as I get enough to make the next thing and live and eat, basically. So yeah, that's because there's no right way to like get a film financed or get an artwork distributed. Basically all I've learned is that everyone's making up as they go along, and
yeah,
that's how it's going to be for probably forever, I guess. which is reassuring in a weird way.
There is too, though, like the way you release your works, like you are putting films on Vimeo, your music's available on Bandcamp, it is accessible and it's not necessarily restricted in the way the other artworks are, or like circulation is controlled by you.
Right. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love designing installations. It's kind of what I do. The ideal conditions that you're going to encounter my work. So, for example, Geomancer and AIDOL, the first time they're shown in like very like site-specific installations that kind of evoke the aesthetic of the film as well. But it's not essential, I guess. And so ideally, I would like it done in certain conditions. And of course, some artists are very strict about this work can only be seen in these conditions, right? For me personally, I've played whatever. I've played video games on my phone. I've played them on my laptop. I've played them on a desktop PC. That I enjoy it, right? I've seen films in all sorts of different contexts. I've read books that are falling apart in like nicely printed editions. I don't know. I don't think that's as important as access.
Yeah, I mean, also though, you've you turned the museum space from Geomancer into an actual game that people could play in a gallery setting, like in like taking what we would perceive as, you said animation versus 3D space, and actually like squashing the divide even more and allowing people to actually wander through the flooded casino. Right.
I mean, I think so. The game 2065, which is based on Geomancer, so that was actually done for a kind of, it's a gallery space called K11 Art Space, but K11 it's a series. It's basically a real estate developer. K11 it's a series of art malls. So the concept is shopping mall plus art. So each of these shopping malls throughout China, and this one was in Hong Kong, which was the first one that they made, is based on this concept, and it's specifically targeted towards millennials. And so initially after the show, they posted lots of social media, literally of teenagers taking selfies in the installation. So of course, if I was like, biased against like, why are they, using my artwork as a selfie point, I would be like, that shouldn't be the right way. But I just thought, it's Hong Kong. If I was 15, like going to the shopping mall with a date or whatever, I would like to do that. So anyway, then I started questioning, my bias towards how works are presented. And I was like, that's fine, basically.
Yeah.
It's just really different kind of cultural values on aesthetics or like, popular culture. And again, so for me, it's like I'm taking my inspiration from video games that are free to play. Who am I to judge, really?
Have you thought about releasing the maps of your films online? I don't know how exactly you do that, but...
Yeah, I've actually done that quite a lot before. I think, the first 7 or 8 virtual worlds that I did, which only had a game and a short film attached to them, on a site called bonuslevels.net. So they're downloadable and playable, but I don't underestimate the labor that goes into actually making a video game, even if it's like a non-playable walking simulator.
Yeah.
Just because I haven't really had time to do it. So I think any proper release, I would just need to spend time doing it. Just like, sometimes I release the soundtracks for my films, and it's not like I just, release the audio file. I kind of think
exactly.
about how
they're different.
Exactly. So even just to do even 2065 as a video game released online as a download, I would really think about redoing a lot of things and having a lot of visual signposting, just like messages, information within the game, which obviously isn't needed if you're in the physical space that the game's about.
There's also like a blurring though, like you've just released, your most recent album is not Idol, it's an album called Temple, which is a club that's set 20-something years ahead of the events of Idol, but it's also related to an installation that you did. There's like this collapsing, I know you've talked about what's real and what's not, like, Idol itself is allegedly produced by Farsight, so it could be an ad for the album that's forthcoming or an ad for the notion of the music. There's this, like, as much as it is a clever like conceptual conceit linking all these things together, it's also putting the individual, it's like giving a much greater sense of access to the thinking behind an artwork, or at least like it's allowing you to make the connections or to feel like you're within the space of those connections.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's like knowing the background of things is nice, but not necessary.
Yeah.
So again, I think of like how I come across things, right? So sometimes I hear something or I watch something and I like it, and then you read up the story behind it. It's really interesting. So for, Neon Genesis, for example, my friend was like, you should watch it. Quite a while later I did, and then I was like, oh, this is really interesting. Then you read that, the director was going through like depression or whatever, so it was like reading up about this stuff, and they kind of embedded it within the work. So I really find, sounds really cheesy, but I really find the stories behind how things are made fascinating, because it kind of takes them down from this like position of, great works, which they still are, but great things that were made in everyday life, which is, of course, how they were done. So I really enjoy that side of things. So, for me, if someone just listens to the music and it's, they're cooking dinner or whatever, that's great, or watches the films while they're having lunch, whatever, I don't care. I watch lots of films eating, right?
Yeah.
So that's fine. But I think if people want to dig deeper, then they can. And, because I personally like doing that. I love just reading stuff on Wikipedia, which is why I have random anecdotes to say about.
Well, I do think though, like, your work invites like that dual reading. You can go all in and see the connection between like Sinofuturism and Wong Kar-wai, these sort of histories and these influences. But you can also, as publications do, just review your album. As music.
Exactly.
As music with one line that mentions an exhibition, and then the rest is an analysis of the songs.
Exactly. And I think, and that's totally fine.
Yeah.
I think, the main thing I think about sometimes is, there's so much freedom to do, the soundtrack and like the script and the installation and that, it's amazing and really freeing. But at the same time, I try and be aware that, you know, like just having that like ability for world building also gives you a certain responsibility to try and make sure that it's good, whatever your standard is, you know, because of course, like, my films, I'm not beholden to like getting the green light from 6 different producers or whatever. And that's an amazing freedom. So I think, you know, my responsibility is just to try and make it better and better and better. So for example, you know, just I think the last thing I'll end on is that when I was showing AIDOL and doing Q&A before, I realized that trying to be a good film director and trying to be a good video artist are related, but actually 2 separate things, you know? In general, people who are seeing your films, and I'm the same, they really only care about how their experiences of that thing, right? It's like a restaurant, right? It's like, I don't care if you're the world's greatest chef. I just want to know that this meal is good and, you know, the chips aren't soggy and stuff like that. Whereas like actually as a visual artist, you kind of you're in a safer place, but you can be complacent. So for example, like in the K11 show with 2065, the institution or curator or critic, they'll contextualize your work, right? Like Susan is an important artist because for the past 40 years, she's been doing X, Y, and Z and used to live on the moon and canoed to Alaska, whatever.
Sure, yeah.
Film director, you know, from the producers of, you know.
Yeah, it's a more face value thing. Yeah, it's a.
What's it?
That must have been like AIDOL when it played at Rotterdam. You must have had that people who'd seen the film or reviewed the film who weren't familiar with Geomancer or with your other work, who, you know, took it at a face value that ultimately isn't especially helpful. I mean, it was interesting for us to play the film in Sydney to an audience that had never really heard of it, and I think it was well received in Sydney. But I can definitely admit, like, watching Geomancer and then watching AIDOL straight away is a completely different experience to just watching AIDOL on its own, in terms of world building, in terms of like the in-world history. The ideological arguments are actually connected across the things, and they also have their origin in Sinofuturism. I hope the people watching the stream, you know, who sat through all 3 of them in a row suddenly realize that there's this greater totality. Exactly. If anyone sat through, you know, all 3 and a bit hours and all of this,
unlocked something.
Exactly. A little bonus thing will come up.
All you get is credits.
Yeah.
No, I think it's sorry. Now the last thing I will end on. It's interesting because some people, I feel, really. Let me rephrase this. I think in film going, in cultural theory, in anything, in aesthetics or culture in general, there's like a negative portrayal of the audience as like a passive viewer, right? You're eating your popcorn, watching the film, you're playing your video games mindlessly. But I think that's really does the audience a disservice, because I found that people actually really express their personality in how they consume media, but they'll never tell you about it. So for example, some of my friends, they read 12 books at once and they actually finish all of them, just not at the same time. Some people like read a book, and if it's bad after the first chapter, they'll just stop reading it. So, but I kind of have to finish the book I'm reading. It's like a commitment, at least so I know if it's bad, I'll know it's bad. Some people walk out of films. I never walk out of film. I'm like, I just want to see how it ends, right? I've kind of like invested anyway. What's that next 3 minutes going to do for you? You're just going to be on your phone or whatever. So there's kind of, and in video games, so some people are like completers. They want to complete everything. They want to like find all the secret items, all the, you know, Easter eggs, all the secret rooms. Other people are more like, you know, hackers. They want to like break the game. In my experience, they want to like jump off the edge of the world. They want to like try and walk through all the walls to see where your game design was kind of messed and screwed up a bit. And other people are just explorers, you know. Other people want to get high points. So people really, and it's just like in real life, some people really like traveling. Some people really like staying at home. Some people love breaking the rules. Some people want to win the game and get rich in Grand Theft Auto or something. So it's really impossible to like judge an audience based on your own preconceptions. And also, especially in film, or even in exhibitions or as a novelist, you really, really know how people perceive or experience your work. And actually, that's why I really enjoy exhibitions, because you see that interaction or interest or complete lack of interest, and that's just interesting, So it's actually a huge, diverse range of impressions that you get.
Yeah, that's the beauty of a pan platform sort of artistic process or artistic output. Yeah, cool. I think that's a really good note to end it on. Yeah, thanks a lot for taking the time to chat.
Yeah, no worries. And if you made it this far, congratulations.
Yes, indeed. Cool. So, yeah, all of you who just sat through 3 films and then an extended Q&A, you win a medal. Send us an email. Let us know what you thought. Keen to hear it. But yeah, thanks a lot, Lawrence, for spending your time with us today. And yeah, thanks again for helping us screen your films. Very excited to do it.
Great. Thanks so much. And thanks for watching.